Our program for this evening, part one will be Michael sharing with us for about 30 minutes on the topic of the children of Jew-Gentile couples during the Second Temple period, a major focus of his doctoral research. After Michael's lecture, we will have a discussion time of around 20 minutes. We will then have some closing comments and conclude our program at around 8 p.m. Well, without further ado, let's begin. Please join me in welcoming Michael Gabazon.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. Happy to be here with you. It's a pleasure to be visiting the King's University in Texas, not only because it allots me the opportunity to leave the ever-lingering winter of Canada, because we just got snow like a couple of days ago, but because of the university's reputation as an evangelical institution of higher education. I'm especially excited about the role the King's University plays in fostering thinkers and scholars and contributors to the Messianic Jewish movement and placing Messianic Judaism in conversation with broader streams of Christianity. So it is truly an honor to be here with you tonight. Now this evening, I'll be providing a snapshot of my current doctoral work, which I'm running at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. And for my research, I study the status of children from intermarried couples in the Hebrew Bible and the Second Temple period. So this means children from marriages between a Jewish spouse and a non-Jewish spouse. And what I examine is whether they were accepted in the community or whether they were rejected in the community or some form in the middle. And the major question is why? Why was there fluctuation on these types of decisions? Throughout this lecture, I will refer to children from intermarried couples as mixed children or mixed offspring. Now, my own interest in the topic of mixed offspring began around 2015 when I was doing research on the matrilineal principle in Judaism. In the Mishnah, which is a book of law for Jewish life, in the 2nd century CE, it gives a ruling on mixed children. And it says, in the event that you have a child from an intermarriage going on, then the child takes the status of their mother. In other words, if one has a Jewish father but a Gentile mother, the child is considered a Gentile. And what piqued my interest was how this legal ruling stood in stark contrast to what you find in much Jewish literature preceding the Mishnah. For example, on the basis of the matrilineal principle, what would we say about the sons of Moses, Gershom and Eliezer, who married Zipporah? Their wife was a Midianite. Or the son of King Solomon, King Rehoboam of Judah, whose mother was an Ammonite. Would these children have been considered Jewish? These questions led me to research and examine how mixed offspring were perceived in the Hebrew Bible and the Second Temple literature. And to my surprise, the results were quite divergent. In some texts, they were accepted as full members of the community. They could contribute to the political, military realm of society. Yet in other texts, they were ostracized and they were kicked out. So in light of these results, I decided to focus my research on these mixed offspring, going forward with two questions. First, how were these mixed offspring portrayed? And second, what influenced those viewpoints? Was it a matter of external laws that the Jewish people tended to adopt for themselves, or was it interpretive methods of the Hebrew Bible? And these are the questions I intend to explore with you tonight. Now, this evening, I'm going to be dealing with a limited number of texts, ones that we're generally more familiar with from the Hebrew Bible and Second Temple period. Nevertheless, I do believe that the selected corpus reveals kind of the main approaches we do see about towards mixed offspring. Now, first, a couple of preliminary notes. When I use the term children, I'm not referring to an age. I'm not referring to children who are between 5 and 15. I'm not referring to a temporal category. I'm referring to one's status in relationship to their parents. So whether one is 5, 15, or 50, you are still the child of your parents. So I'm more interested in their status. Therefore, I will supplement children with terms like offspring or descendants. These are all meant to be synonymous. Also, throughout the presentation, I will employ the term Jewish. to refer to communities in the Hebrew Bible before the nation of Israel, during the nation of Israel, after the nation of Israel. I'm fully cognizant that the term Jewish may be problematic when you apply it to ancient texts. Nevertheless, I will use it for the sake of simplicity. You feel free to push back during the question time. Now, based on my research, I have 4 main categories in which we are able to see how mixed offspring were depicted in the Hebrew Bible and the Second Temple period. The first category we'll call accepted. Offspring with mixed pedigree in this section are in good standing. They're able to contribute in the military and political realm of the community without issue. This is by far the most prominent example we find in the Hebrew Bible and an early Second Temple period. The next category is accepted but socially demoted. Some communities in the post-exilic era were more troubled by the presence of mixed offspring, particularly because the offspring had an ambiguous ethnic affiliation. In other words, it was unknown whether they were committed to the ethnic religion of Israel or that of their foreign parent. While these offspring were still considered Jewish, insofar as they were not expelled from the community, contemporary biblical scholars speculate that they were socially demoted, meaning incapable of having a leadership role in the community. Our third section is excluded. Unlike the previous 2 categories where the offspring were still considered Jewish, in this section here, the mixed offspring was no longer considered part of the community. This is due to the genealogical mixing. In other words, due to the fact that their DNA was mixed, they were no longer considered holy nation Israel. Now they were profane and kicked out. We'll see an example of this in Ezra's expulsion narrative in Ezra 9 through 10. And finally, we have excluded and troublesome. Instead of viewing mixed offspring as either Jewish or non-Jewish, some communities in the Second Temple text viewed them as a type of hybrid entity. Somewhere in the middle, something negative about improper mixing. And so because they were a mixed offspring, because they were a hybrid type of entity, they had a propensity for wickedness. And that's why they were dangerous. We see examples of this in 1st Enoch and some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but for tonight we're going to look at the book of Jubilees for our example. Now, of course, not every example that we find in the Hebrew Bible and Second Temple literature fits nicely into this paradigm here, unfortunately, or else my dissertation would be pretty much done. Instead, this is really intended to be kind of a starting point for our discussions, something to go forward. Now, granted that the conversation about mixed offspring, who's Jewish, who's not Jewish, and the children could become somewhat convoluted, I have included stick figures at the top of the screen. If on the right-hand side you have these individuals up there, this means that the husband was Jewish and the wife was not. Vice versa, if this figure is up, this means that the wife was Jewish and the husband was not. I'll do the same thing with names as we put them up there. So, for our first category, we'll be looking at the accepted mixed offspring. In our first case, we're going to look where we have a Jewish father and a Gentile mother. And one situation is found in Genesis 38. We're introduced to Judah. Judah was one of the sons of Jacob. And in Genesis 38, he marries an unnamed Canaanite woman. We don't know her name, but she bore him 3 children, Onan, and Shelah. One thing led to another, and Judah married Tamar. Tamar was likely also a Canaanite as well. We don't know her ethnic background, but she was in that geographical region, so there's no reason to presume otherwise. And she bore Judah, Zerah, and Perez. Now, for all intents and purposes, all these offspring were mixed. They were from a mixed marriage. Nevertheless, that had no implication on their leadership capacity in the nation of Israel. According to Numbers 26:20, the sons of Judah, according to their families, were of Shelah, the family of the Shelonites, of Perez, the family of the Perizzites, and Zerah, the family of the Zerahites. They were clan leaders, meaning they were able to contribute to both the political as well as the military realm in Israel. Furthermore, when you look at the book of Chronicles, which is largely a rewriting of the history of Israel, at times you would have the author put in parenthetical statements. They would leave out certain facts, they would include others, they would make parenthetical statements on judgments, and yet in 1 Chronicles it identifies all 3 sons, Perez, Zerah, and Shelah, as the sons of Judah without any qualifying remark. It was not an issue. Our next example comes from Moses. Moses married Zipporah, the daughter of a Midianite priest, who bore him Gershom and Eleazar. Now, despite their mixed offspring, Gershom and Eleazar were eventually considered part of the priesthood. As for Moses, the man of God, his sons were to be reckoned among the tribe of Levi, the sons of Moses, Gershom and Eleazar. Not only that, but Moses' grandchildren also became chief priests. Now, later on in Jewish law code, in the Holiness Code in Leviticus, mixed offspring were no longer allowed to become priests. Nevertheless, you have Gershom and Eleazar part of that community. Now, when looking at Jewish communities that we know of outside of the Hebrew Bible, we see a very similar phenomenon. For example, we know of the well-established Jewish community in Elephantine, Egypt. In Elephantine, Egypt, around the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, 6th to 4th century, there was a community in Elephantine, and they were well-established. It was a Judean community. They had their own temple, and were able to recover a lot of their contracts, a lot of their business transactions, their marriage contracts, and that allows us to get a glimpse into their lives. And through these contracts, we come to know an intermarried couple. Ananiah was the male, a Judean male, and he married his wife Tamut, an Egyptian slave, an Egyptian female, and they had two mixed children, Pilti and Jehoshma. Unfortunately, we don't know much about Pilti, but we're able to follow the life of Jehoshma relatively closely through these contracts. And despite being a mixed offspring, she appeared to be fully accepted within the community. She had a Judean name, which was actually very uncommon. Living in Egypt, if your mother was a slave, you would take your mother's name. She was able to receive an inheritance from her parents, which is very customary for offspring and a major factor in legal documents. And third, she was able to marry a nice Jewish boy, also named Ananiah, which her father must have been happy about. And when you examine her actual marriage contract, there's no indication that she was of a lesser status due to her mixed status. She received a mohar. She was financially protected in the event of a divorce. She could initiate divorce. And if her husband passed away, she'd be able to inherit everything he owns. Therefore, offspring with Jewish fathers and Gentile mothers were, by and large, considered Jewish without issue. Now, this criterion also stands when you have Jewish women marrying non-Jewish men. One example comes from the book of Samuel. Here we meet Amasa, one of the leaders of Israel's army. 2 Samuel 17:25 states, "Now Absalom had set Amasa over the army in place of Joab. Amasa was the son of a man named Ithra the Ishmaelite, who had married Abigail, daughter of Nahash." Now, the term Nahash here, scholars tend to agree that it's likely a scribal error, and that should actually be the daughter of Jesse, because in Chronicles, Abigail is known as the sister of King David, which means Amasa is King David's nephew. So, despite his mixed status, not only was he able to be a leader in Israel by being a military leader, but also King David says in 2 Samuel 19, "You are my brothers, you are my bone and my flesh. Say to Amasa, are you not my bone and my flesh?" Thereby underscoring his kinship affiliation with Amasa. Therefore, despite Amasa's mixed status, his position in the community was not jeopardized. One final example comes from the New Testament. In Acts 16, a well-known narrative about Timothy. Paul was going on a missionary journey, and he met Timothy, whose mother was Jewish and his father was not. He goes on to state, Paul went to Lystra, where there was a disciple named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him. He took him and had him circumcised because of the Jews who were in those places. So a major point of contention is, why did Paul circumcise Timothy? I once did a TV interview in like 2012, and it was in Detroit, and a pastor was going to interview me, and we were in the back room right before. It was going to be on Messianic Judaism, and this was his one pressing question. In light of Paul's statements in Galatians, why on earth was Timothy circumcised? I posit that Timothy was circumcised because Paul considered him Jewish based on his mother's status. And this makes the most sense in light of both the close context as well as the rest of the New Testament. On the one hand, you have the Jerusalem Council, which happened right in the chapter before. And in the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, they said Gentiles do not need to become Jews. It'd be very odd if right in the next chapter you have a Gentile becoming Jewish. Also, when you contrast Timothy with Titus, Titus also went on a missionary journey with Paul. Titus also went to the Jewish people. And yet in Galatians, it says, but even Titus, who was with me, was not compelled to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. So there is no reason for Timothy to be circumcised except if he were considered Jewish in light of his mother. So from these examples, it's apparent that mixed offspring, whether they had a Jewish father and a Gentile mother or vice versa, were full participants in the community of Israel. They were able to take part in the cultic, political, and religious endeavors. That's our category number one. Category number two, accepted but socially demoted. This is where the offspring were still considered Jewish, yet seemed to be socially limited. Our example comes from the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah was very instrumental in bringing reforms to the Jewish community. Israel was kicked out of the land, Judea, from the Babylonian exile. They were brought back. They're reestablishing themselves. Nehemiah comes as a reformer, and he includes a lot of reformations in terms of Sabbath law and whether you could purchase or not. But one of the things he addressed was intermarriage. And towards the end of the book, it says, in those days also I saw Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, Moab, and half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but spoke the language of various peoples. So this statement right here is the key. Half of the children spoke the language of Ashdod, which means that they were unable to speak or understand the Jewish language. Now, on the surface, why bring this up? A simple resolution would be, teach them the language. If we can speculate on the thought process of Nehemiah, since it doesn't tell us explicitly in the text what he was thinking, I would posit that the mention of foreign language was actually indicative of a deeper issue. Namely, it reflected the child's foreign national and religious affiliation. In other words, their inability to speak the Judean language represented their attachment to the ethnic upbringing of their mother, not the Judean community. In the case of Nehemiah, the foreign language of the mixed offspring demonstrated they were unable or uninterested in preserving the group identity. Now, from contemporary ethnographic studies, we're able to see the correlation between one's language and their religious affiliation. Eisenlohr's work in 2007, entitled Little India, he studied this diverse multi-ethnic community population in Mauritius, which is an island about 1,200 miles off the African continent. And he argues that Hindus, who make up about 50% of that population, even though they don't live in their native land, they maintain their religious tradition in that setting through their linguistic practices. So, in Mauritius, English is the official language. French is the professional language. Then you have Mauritian Creole, which is the everyday language, and yet the state still provides political and financial support for Hindi, which is rarely used, but it helps create, quote, an ethnic group identification, close quote, and maintains religious identity. Language allows diasporic communities to continue their religious traditions. So if we can apply this to the text in Nehemiah, the primary issue with the mixed offspring was what their language indicated. It indicated that their social and religious affiliations lay elsewhere, namely with the religion of their mother. So what does this mean for the social status in the community? Insofar as we know, they were accepted as Judeans. They were not expelled like we see in other texts. Nevertheless, because Nehemiah was very focused on the political viability and independence of the Judean community, it was biblical scholars believe that these mixed offspring were limited in their contributions which they could provide. And the notion of limiting mixed offspring is actually found in contemporary literature to Nehemiah. When you look at Greek texts about the Persian royals, they often had concubines, and the concubines were often foreign, and offspring from foreign concubines were considered illegitimate children. They were well taken care of, but they could not assume leadership positions. And so perhaps Nehemiah was influenced by that viewpoint as well. Therefore, Nehemiah likely interpreted the children's inability to speak the Jewish language as an allegiance to a foreign entity, resulting in a demoted or limited position in the community. While Nehemiah apparently allowed them to remain there, we witness a different scenario in our third case. So first we had their accepted, next we have accepted but demoted, and third we have excluded. In our third category, unlike the previous two, the mixed offspring in this section were no longer considered Jewish, but were expelled from the community. We get our example from the book of Ezra, Ezra 9 through 10. Now, similar to Nehemiah, the book of Ezra recounts the return from Babylon for the Jewish community, and Ezra, he comes as a priest and, most importantly, as an interpreter of the law for the people. And like Nehemiah, Ezra was also concerned with the intermarriage in the community. He saw this as a major issue. And so one of the things he attempted to do, or that was recommended to him, was to expel the foreign wives and their children. It states in Ezra 10, 2 through 3, "We have broken faith with our God and have married foreign women from the peoples of the land. And even now there is hope for Israel in spite of this. So now let us make a covenant with our God and send away all these wives and their children, and let it be done according to the law." So for the first time in Jewish literature, in as far as we know, children with a Jewish father and a Gentile mother were no longer considered Jewish. Now, this statement right here raises many questions. One being, why expel the children? And the second, with what law is this in accordance with? Now, scholars have proposed various options for understanding this complex narrative. Some say that Ezra wanted to expel all the foreign kids because he didn't want them to inherit Judean land. There was a similar law going on in Athens at this time. Pericles, he created this law where if you're Athenian, you need to have two Athenian parents or else you cannot inherit land. So they think maybe Ezra just adopted that mindset. However, from what we know about unjustified divorces in Babylonian and Jewish contracts, that would have been a terrible decision. The wives would have still received some form of dowry, and the children would still have been entitled to the inheritance of the land. Jansen appropriately states that if Ezra's community was concerned with the loss of land, quote, "the last thing it would do would be to force its members to divorce without cause." Most importantly, close quote, most importantly, that doesn't explain why you exile the children. What was wrong at this point? I believe the key to comprehending this narrative is through understanding how Ezra interpreted and applied the Hebrew Bible laws to his current situation. Michael Fishbane, for example, appropriately notes how Ezra often applied Pentateuchal laws from the Pentateuch to his current situation, but he would often tweak them or broaden the application, which is actually a relatively frequent occurrence of hermeneutics that we see in the Second Temple period. For example, this is a very famous prohibition against intermarriage. It's from Deuteronomy 7. At this point, Israel was about to enter into the land, and God instructed them, "When the Lord your God clears away the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hittites, and the Jebusites, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, for they will turn your sons away from following me." So at this point, God is instructing the nation of Israel, when you enter Canaan, there are 7 specific Canaanite nations you cannot intermarry with. Others, seems fine. Deuteronomy 21, they can intermarry with others and there's no big issue. These specific ones you are not allowed to intermarry with. However, when this passage is alluded to by the leader in Ezra's community, this law is taken, but it's applied to all foreign women. This is why they could appeal to the law and expel the women from Babylon. The people of Israel have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands. This is from Ezra 9. They come up to him, and this is what they're telling him. "According to their abominations, from the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. For they have taken some of their daughters as wives. Thus the holy seed has mixed itself with the peoples of the land." Now first, notice the similar nations that are being mentioned. The law from Deuteronomy 7 is being taken and applied to their current situation. They're broadening the application. So we see one example of this. More importantly, notice the difference between the rationale. In Deuteronomy 7, you shall not intermarry because they will turn your sons away from following me, meaning you're going to enter into idolatry. However, with Ezra, it's different. For Ezra, thus the holy seed has mixed itself with the peoples of the land. In the book of Ezra, the major issue was not simply idolatry, but the genealogical mixing of the holy seed and the holy people. Williamson correctly states that the use of holy seed instead of holy people, which is more common, quote, "concentrates on the physical transmission of holiness," close quote. It looks towards the children. So it's apparent that this genealogical mixing negatively impacted the status of their offspring, marking them as outsiders from the community. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, there's only one other location where you see a genealogically mixed child that is disqualified based on that mixed genealogy. And that's found in the book of Leviticus, which Ezra quotes from relatively often. Leviticus 21, it gives the marriage laws for the priest, and it says, the priest shall marry only a woman who is a virgin. He shall marry a virgin of his own kin, which is, we're not sure if that's within the priestly line or within the nation of Israel, but that's neither here nor there, that he may not profane his offspring. So in the event that a priest becomes intermarried, the offspring will no longer be able to serve as a priest. They're now considered profane, meaning regular, no longer set apart or holy. So, why would Ezra send away these mixed offspring? In light of Ezra's use of the Hebrew Bible, it can be argued that just as Ezra took the Deuteronomy 7 prohibition and applied it to all foreigners, so he took the Leviticus 21 criterion for marriage and applied it to all Israel. To him, all Israel is the holy nation, is a priestly nation, which you see in the Second Temple period, a theme reoccurring. At this point in history, Israel was not allowed to intermarry at all. Christine Hayes at Yale University calls this Ezra's genealogical purity model. According to Ezra, Jewishness was only recognized if both parents were Jewish. Within this model, there's no such thing as conversion, and there's no such thing as being absorbed into the Jewish community like we see elsewhere. Therefore, the offspring from intermarried couples were now profane and no longer holy. This broadened application of Leviticus 21 to all Israel provided Ezra with the authority to expel all foreigners. Lineage becomes central. So here we have our three categories. And just to say, after the excluded, and with Ezra, about 450 BCE, you really see two types of groups develop in the Second Temple period in the rest of the literature. Some did not accept his exclusionary approach, and they were welcoming of converts or welcoming of children who were mixed, but there were other texts that were much more in line with his genealogical approach, that you cannot have any outsiders mixing or being brought into the community. And one of these is found in the book of Jubilees. Now, Jubilees goes a little bit further than Ezra. Ezra would say, if your parents intermarried, you're no longer considered Jewish. You're profane, you're outside. Jubilees says, if your parents intermarried, you are now kind of a hybrid offspring that's troublesome, that's inherently wicked, that's not right, because you're supposed to only give birth and bear children according to your kind. And this is the example we find in the book of Jubilees. Now, the book of Jubilees was written around the 2nd century BCE. It's largely considered to be rewritten Bible, which I find one of the most fascinating narratives. Essentially, it's a rewriting of Genesis and the first part of Exodus. And if you know those stories, you're able to read Jubilees and see where they changed stories, what they included, what they left out. So it gives us insight into their community. Now, the author of Jubilees, like Ezra, argued that non-Jews were not able to convert nor be absorbed into the community. Therefore, one major emphasis was endogamy. Jews can only marry Jews. That's how you keep the holy line. For example, there's a short little narrative where Rebecca, she's giving instruction to her son about who to marry. She says, "My son, do not marry the Canaanite women like your brother Esau, who has married 2 wives from the descendants of Canaan. Marry someone from your father's house. The Most High God will bless you. Your father will be your family will become a righteous family. And here's the key, your descendants will be holy. They will remain holy, set apart." And we see this notion even in genealogies. For example, Adam and Eve, they have their son Seth. And Seth marries his sister, Azurah, and that's a good marriage. You want to marry someone within the family line. They have a wonderful daughter named Noam, meaning lovely. In another example, you have Peleg. Peleg marries an unknown woman. Their son is named Ru, meaning evil. Right after he's born, you have the building of the Tower of Babel. In some, having mixed children is problematic. In order to illustrate the danger of mixing, Jubilees takes the famous story from Genesis 6, 1 through 4. In Genesis 6, 1 through 4, this is where you see the sons of God, who it was interpreted that they were angels, came down and they mixed with the daughters of men, with humans, and they bore children. In the Hebrew Bible, they're often called the Nephilim, but we don't hear much about them at all. In the Second Temple period, that story becomes extremely popular about these angels coming down and impregnating women. If anyone has seen the 2014 movie Noah with Aronofsky, you probably saw these giants of some sort, these rock men. This is actually kind of a mixture of the tradition in First Enoch and in Jubilees. But in Jubilees, the idea is that these watchers came down, they intermixed with women, and they bore giants. They bore children. It states, the sons of God and the daughters of men gave birth to children from them, and they were giants. Wickedness increased on the earth. All animate beings corrupted their way. So the author links the creation of these giants with corruption on the earth. Jubilees continues to describe what was done to these giants. Regarding the watchers' children, these giants, there went out from God's presence in order to strike them with the sword. They began to kill each other until all of them fell with the sword and were obliterated from the earth. And here's the key part. God made a new and righteous nature for all his creatures so that they would not sin with their whole nature until eternity. Everyone will be righteous, each according to his kind. So the reason for their wickedness was directly related to their mixed nature. The notion that they were not procreating according to their kind was very bad. It was this mixed hybrid status that was linked with their wicked actions. Now, scholars agree that in the beginning of Jubilees, you have the story of the watchers, and it's this story that functions as an apologetic or as a reason why you don't intermarry, because your children will not be according to your kind. And you see Abraham use this example when he's speaking with his children. They are not to commit sexual offenses by following their eyes and their hearts so that they take wives for themselves from the Canaanite woman, because the descendants of Canaan will be uprooted from the earth. Abraham told them about the punishment of the giants. The giants functioned as a warning why you should not intermarry. Your children will not be according to your kind, but they will bring wickedness. So, one final example that we see in the book of Jubilees is the retelling of the story of Judah and his Canaanite wife. Now, if you remember, this is the first one that I mentioned. In this case here, we have Judah. He marries a Canaanite woman. She bears him Er, Onan, and Shelah. Now, before Judah marries Tamar, he actually wants Tamar to marry his first son, Er. In the Hebrew Bible, all we're told is that Er was wicked, and so therefore the Lord killed him. We're not given any more details. Jubilees, and you see this very often in rewritten literature, rewritten Bible in the Second Temple period, they love to fill in these details. Why? Why was he killed? What was the background for it? And so here we're given an explanation that links Er's wickedness directly with his mother. Judah took as a wife for his firstborn Er, one of the Aramean women. Notice that her background is now shared, that she's an Aramean, so it's a proper marriage. An Aramean woman. Er hated her and did not lie with her because his mother was a Canaanite woman and he wanted to marry someone from his mother's tribe. But his father Judah did not allow him. That Er, Judah's firstborn, was evil and the Lord killed him. So it directly correlates Judah's wickedness with the influence and the status of his mother. And you see this example elsewhere also, for example, with Esau. Esau, he has kids from a Canaanite woman, and those kids hate Jacob for what he did. And they want to attack Jacob, they want to attack his children. And Esau, he repented, he changed his mind. He said, listen, it's fine, don't worry about it. And their wickedness prevailed, and they fought against their cousins. Therefore, the book of Jubilees portrays mixed offspring from mixed marriages as troublesome, who are morally problematic and most definitely not Jewish. So here we have our four categories. This here provides a summary of the four main ways that mixed offspring were viewed in the Hebrew Bible and the Second Temple period. My goal this evening was to provide a broad, bird's eye view look at the various ways offspring were treated and understood in the Hebrew Bible. Now, one thing is certain, at this time there was no homogeneous ruling. You see fluctuations on who was considered in and who was considered out in these various texts. The first time we have kind of a universal homogeneous ruling is what we find in Mishnah. That's where the rabbis tried to say, no, it's only through the mother. And of course, after the break of the Reform movement, that is no longer held to today. So we're still having the discussion and the argument, who is a Jew? While we did not have time to deal with other important narratives that help further clarify or complicate the current paradigm, My hope is that the proposed outline will be a starting point, a springboard to better understand how the threads of Jewishness, genealogy, intermarriage, and children interweave together in the Hebrew Bible and the Second Temple period. Thank you.